Right now, if you search Gene Hackman's name online, you will run into a video, then another, all claiming the same thing. A secret tunnel, sealed beneath his library, 40 feet underground, FBI agents cutting through iron doors, bodies, hundreds of them. A hidden network that nobody, not even his own staff, ever knew existed. It sounds like something out of one of his own movies. And that is exactly the problem, because none of it happened, not one word of it. There is no tunnel. There is no secret door. There was no FBI raid on a hidden underground chamber. What there is something far stranger, far sadder, and far more real than any manufactured horror story could ever be. And once you hear what investigators actually pieced together, minute by minute, from a dead man's pacemaker, from a grocery store parking lot camera, from an email that was never opened, you will understand why this story didn't need to be exaggerated in the first place. The truth was disturbing enough on its own. Let's start with where the rumor even came from, because that matters. In the days after Gene Hackman was found dead, a wave of copycat channels flooded the internet with dramatic thumbnails and breathless narration about a hidden passage beneath his Santa Fe estate. One video would rack up hundreds of thousands of views, and within days, 5 more nearly identical versions would appear, each one adding a new twist, a new impossible detail, a new claim about what agents supposedly uncovered underground. Fact-checkers went looking for the source. They found nothing. No police report mentioned a tunnel. No press conference referenced one. The Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office, the New Mexico Office of the Medical Investigator, and even the FBI, when asked directly, confirmed there was no tunnel investigation of any kind. The entire narrative traced back to a single YouTube video with no named sources, no documents, no corroboration, just confident narration over stock footage. And yet it spread because it was built to spread. It had all the ingredients: a beloved celebrity, an isolated mansion, secrecy, and the suggestion that something sinister had been buried literally for decades. The only problem is that a manufactured mystery isn't a mystery at all. It's just a story someone made up because the real one required patience to tell properly. So we're going to tell it properly. Before we go any further, sit with that for a second. A pacemaker, a tiny device implanted in a man's chest decades earlier to keep his heart beating on schedule, ended up becoming the single most important witness in his own death investigation. Not a person, not a camera, a machine, quietly logging heartbeats no one was ever meant to read unless something went wrong. And something did go wrong, in a way so slow and so quiet that by the time anyone realized it, there was nothing left to do but piece it back together, one data point at a time. That's the story we're actually telling here. Not a conspiracy, a reconstruction. And once you understand how investigators built it, you'll never look at those fake tunnel videos the same way again. Gene Hackman was 95 years old. Betsy Arakawa, his wife of 34 years, was 65. They lived together in a gated community outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a home they had owned for decades, a private, quiet property tucked into the high desert landscape that Hackman had grown to love after leaving Hollywood behind. He had not appeared in a film in over 20 years. He had walked away from the industry entirely, choosing instead a life of near total privacy, painting, writing novels, and simply existing away from the noise that had followed him since the 1970s, when a single explosive performance in a film about a relentless, obsessive detective made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. That role earned him his first Academy Award, and 2 decades later, a second one followed, this time for playing a brutal, morally complicated sheriff in a Western that redefined the genre for an entire generation of filmmakers. In between and after, he built one of the most consistent, respected bodies of work in American film, playing everyone from disgraced coaches to paranoid surveillance experts to power-hungry villains, always with the same unmistakable intensity that made directors fight to cast him. And then, sometime in the early 2000s, he simply stopped. No dramatic farewell tour, no retirement special. He gave a handful of interviews explaining that he'd simply lost the appetite for the grind of movie making, the waiting around, the travel, the performing for cameras that had nothing to do with acting itself. He moved to Santa Fe full-time, and from that point on, the world mostly saw him the way he wanted to be seen, rarely and on his own terms. Locals in Santa Fe would later describe him as approachable in small, ordinary ways, someone who might chat with a barber or browse a farmer's market without making a scene of it, but who otherwise kept almost entirely to himself and to his wife. By the time he reached his 90s, most of the public had lost track of him entirely. He wasn't hiding from anything sinister. He was just an old man who had chosen solitude, and for years, that solitude worked exactly as he wanted it to. Until the last week of February, when that solitude turned into something no one could have predicted, and by the time anyone noticed, it was already far too late. On February 26th, a maintenance worker showed up at the property for a routine visit. Nothing about the call suggested anything was wrong. This was the kind of ordinary, forgettable task that happens at properties like this every week. But something felt off almost immediately. The gate wasn't answered. There was no response from inside. After repeated attempts to reach anyone in the home, the worker made the call that would set off a national story. Santa Fe County deputies arrived at the property and forced their way in, and what they found inside would take investigators weeks, not hours, to fully make sense of. Gene Hackman was discovered on the floor of a room near the kitchen, close to a walking cane and a pair of sunglasses, as though he had simply fallen mid-step. Betsy Arakawa was found in a bathroom with an open prescription bottle nearby and pills scattered across the countertop. One of their 3 dogs, a small dog that had recently undergone a veterinary procedure, was found dead inside its crate in a closet near her. The other 2 dogs were alive, wandering the property. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no trauma, just an unsettling stillness that had clearly been sitting in that house for a long time before anyone walked in to see it. And that detail, the stillness, the sheer amount of time that had clearly passed, is what turned this from a tragic discovery into a genuine investigative puzzle. Because almost immediately, responding officers could tell that these 2 people had not died on the same day. The state of the bodies made that clear before any lab work was even done. One body showed far more advanced decomposition than the other. Investigators would later describe visible mummification in Arakawa's hands, a detail that, however uncomfortable it is to say out loud, told them something crucial. This was not a sudden joint tragedy. This was 2 separate deaths, days apart, inside the same home, with one of them, quite possibly, having no idea the other had already happened. That single realization is the actual heart of this story. And it's the part that got buried under fake tunnels and manufactured government conspiracies. Because if 2 people who lived together, who loved each other for over 3 decades, died nearly a week apart inside the same house, then somebody in that home was alive, alone, for days after their spouse had already died. And piecing together exactly how that happened became the entire focus of the investigation that followed. Within hours of the discovery, speculation exploded, most of it wrong. Carbon monoxide poisoning was the first theory floated publicly, and it actually came from inside the family. Hackman's own daughter told reporters that she and other family members suspected a gas leak, something quick, something that could explain 2 deaths without warning. It was a reasonable guess, and for a day or 2 it dominated headlines. But investigators moved quickly to test it. The New Mexico Gas Company inspected the property's gas lines and appliances directly. They found 5 minor safety concerns, the kind of small technical issues you might find in any older home, but nothing connected to a leak, and nothing that lined up with the timeline investigators were building. Both bodies were tested for carbon monoxide exposure. Both came back negative. That theory, floated within the first 48 hours by people desperate for an explanation, was dead within a week. So investigators went back to basics. This is where the real detective work began, the kind that never involves a hidden tunnel or a secret vault, but instead involves something far more mundane and far more revealing. A monthly planner, 2 cell phones, a home security company's server logs, and a small medical device sitting inside an old man's chest. Investigators started by trying to establish a timeline for Betsy Arakawa's final movements, because early evidence suggested she had likely died first. They pulled surveillance footage from every location she was known to have visited in her last known days alive. On the morning of February 9th, she had picked up their dog from a veterinary hospital following a procedure, which explained why that particular dog was later found inside a crate rather than roaming free with the others. 2 days later, on February 11th, cameras captured her running a string of completely ordinary errands. She was seen at a farmer's market in the early afternoon. She stopped at a pet food store. She was recorded on surveillance cameras inside a CVS pharmacy for several minutes. Nothing about her behavior on any of this footage suggested distress, illness, or urgency. She looked, by every account reviewing the tape, like someone going through a perfectly normal Tuesday. At 5:15 that evening, her car was recorded entering the gated community where she and Hackman lived, using the remote clicker assigned specifically to her vehicle. And after that moment, investigators found nothing. No further outgoing texts, no further emails sent, no additional errands, no more footage, no more digital trace of any kind. It was as if, sometime after 5:15 in the evening on February 11th, Betsy Arakawa simply stopped. But there was one more piece of digital evidence that made the picture even more precise, and honestly, even more haunting. Investigators discovered that on the morning of February 12th, the day after her last confirmed activity, someone using her information contacted a private concierge medical service. She told the person on the phone that she was feeling congested. According to the physician who later spoke about the call, she didn't sound seriously ill, just mildly unwell, the kind of phone call thousands of people make every single day without a second thought. She was told to come in and discuss her symptoms, and an appointment was scheduled for 1:15 that afternoon. She never showed up. When the medical office tried to follow up with a callback, she never answered that either. Investigators would later determine this was almost certainly the last documented human interaction Betsy Arakawa ever had. A short, unremarkable phone call about feeling a little congested. made the morning after what medical examiners would eventually conclude was the actual day of her death. That timing detail matters enormously because it tells us something deeply human about what was actually happening inside that house. She wasn't confused. She wasn't in obvious crisis. She felt off, made a reasonable decision to seek medical advice, scheduled an appointment like anyone would, and then, before that appointment ever arrived, her condition escalated far faster than anyone, including her, could have anticipated. Investigators eventually turned to the state's chief medical investigator, Dr. Heather Gerald, to determine exactly what had killed her, and the answer surprised almost everyone following the case. It wasn't poison, it wasn't violence. It wasn't a leak of any kind. Betsy Arakawa had died of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare but very real illness that is not spread from person to person, but rather contracted through exposure to droppings, urine, or saliva from infected rodents, most commonly deer mice, which are extremely common throughout rural and semi-rural New Mexico. The illness typically begins with symptoms that feel almost identical to a mild flu: fatigue, muscle aches, a slight fever, maybe a cough. It is, in its early stages, one of the most unremarkable feeling illnesses a person can have, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because within just a handful of days, sometimes as few as 3, sometimes as many as 6, the infection can shift violently. Fluid begins building around the lungs and heart. Breathing becomes difficult, then impossible. And according to the very doctor who worked the case, once that transition begins, a person can die within 24 to 48 hours, even with immediate medical treatment. Without it, that window shrinks even further. Dr. Gerald would later explain that this kind of collapse often happens suddenly, sometimes literally mid-motion, the body simply giving out where the person stood. It is not uncommon, she said, for someone in that condition to be found on the floor exactly where the collapse occurred, because there is often no time for anything else to happen first. That detail alone reframes the entire story. This wasn't a slow decline anyone could have caught in time if only they'd noticed sooner. This was a woman who felt a little congested on a Tuesday morning, scheduled a completely reasonable follow-up appointment for that afternoon, and then, before that appointment ever arrived, her own body turned against her with a speed that even trained physicians describe as brutal. The mortality rate for this particular hantavirus strain in the southwestern United States sits somewhere between 38 and 50%, according to state health officials. It is one of the rarest infectious diseases a person can contract in that region, and also one of the deadliest once it progresses. In the 50 years leading up to her death, there had been just over 100 documented cases statewide. She became one of them, almost certainly without ever knowing what was actually happening to her. Now here is where the story turns from tragic to genuinely unsettling. Because if Betsy Arakawa died sometime around February 11th, that means Gene Hackman, 95 years old and living in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease, was left alone inside that house for approximately 1 full week before he, too, died. Investigators didn't have surveillance footage or errand records to build his final timeline the way they did for his wife. Hackman rarely left the property, and by that point in his life, he wasn't driving, wasn't running errands, wasn't generating the kind of digital footprint that made reconstructing Arakawa's last days possible. Instead, investigators had to rely on something almost nobody would think to check: the internal data log of his cardiac pacemaker. A pacemaker doesn't just regulate a heartbeat. It continuously records the heart's activity, time-stamped, down to specific dates. When investigators pulled the data from Hackman's device, they found recorded cardiac activity on February 17th, 6 days after his wife's presumed death. Then, on February 18th, the device recorded something different: an abnormal rhythm, specifically atrial fibrillation, an irregular and often dangerous heartbeat pattern. After that entry, the device recorded nothing further. No more activity, no more rhythm, nothing. The chief medical investigator would later describe this as the most reliable indicator of the actual day Gene Hackman died. Not an assumption, not a guess based on decomposition alone, but a literal internal record from inside his own chest, silently logging the exact moment his heart gave out for the final time. Which means that, for approximately 7 days, an elderly man in advanced cognitive decline lived alone inside that house, with his wife already gone, and, investigators believe, quite possibly without any real understanding that she had died at all. When asked directly whether Hackman may have known his wife had passed, Dr. Gerald gave an answer that has stayed with a lot of people who followed this case closely. She said it was a difficult question to answer definitively, but that given the advanced state of his Alzheimer's, it was, in her words, quite possible he simply did not know. Investigators found no signs that he had attempted to call for help, no evidence of frantic phone calls, no indication he had tried to leave the property or alert anyone that something was catastrophically wrong. The autopsy revealed that Hackman had an empty stomach at the time of his death, meaning he had not eaten for some period of time before he died. though examiners noted he did not show clear signs of dehydration, suggesting his final days were not a prolonged period of complete helplessness, but something more fragmented and harder to fully reconstruct. His official cause of death was listed as hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, essentially severe, long-developing heart disease, with advanced Alzheimer's disease listed as a significant contributing factor. He had a documented history of previous heart attacks and multiple past cardiac procedures. In other words, his body was already carrying serious long-term vulnerabilities well before that final week began. Combine that with the psychological and physical toll of unknowingly living alone, likely disoriented, likely without a full grasp of his surroundings or circumstances, in a large, silent, isolated home, and you start to understand how his heart simply reached its limit. There is one more piece of this puzzle that deserves real attention because it's the piece that got twisted into the tunnel myth in the first place. The idea that there was some hidden mechanism, some secret space investigators uncovered that changed everything. The truth is almost the opposite of dramatic, and that's exactly why it's so haunting. When authorities searched the property, they noted something the sheriff himself pointed out directly. This was an extremely private home. No security cameras were found anywhere on the property. None. For a residence of that size, owned by a man who had once been one of the most recognized faces in the world, the complete absence of any surveillance system stood out immediately to investigators. There was no hidden footage to review because there was no footage at all. Sheriff Adon Mendoza addressed this directly during a press briefing, stating plainly that everyone understood Hackman and Arakawa were, in his words, very private individuals and a very private family. That privacy, which had protected their peace for decades, became the exact thing that made piecing together their final days so agonizingly difficult. There was no footage of Hackman's final week, no digital trail, no witnesses, just a pacemaker log, an empty stomach, and a silence that stretched for 7 days inside a house where nobody was watching, because nobody was ever meant to be. Investigators did recover 2 cell phones from inside the home along with a monthly planner, standard items in any death investigation. They were examined for messages, calls, anything that might fill in gaps in the timeline. What they found largely confirmed what the pacemaker and surveillance footage already suggested. An abrupt stop in Arakawa's activity in mid-February, followed by an extended period of silence from both of them that ended only when a maintenance worker showed up unannounced nearly 2 weeks later. There was also briefly a theory involving Arakawa's prescription medication, since pills were found scattered near her body when she was discovered. This detail, on its own, understandably raised questions, but when the medical examiner addressed it directly, she clarified that the medication was thyroid medication, being taken exactly as prescribed, and was not believed to have contributed to her death in any way. It was simply a bottle that had been knocked over, likely during her final moments, not a clue pointing toward anything more complicated. By the time Dr. Gerald stood in front of reporters on March 7th, 9 days after the discovery, and roughly 3.5 weeks after the earliest estimated date of death, investigators had assembled a complete evidence-based account of what happened inside that house. Betsy Arakawa contracted a rare, fast-moving illness from an ordinary, almost invisible source. Something as simple as rodent droppings in an outdoor structure or a garage or shed, the kind of everyday hazard that exists quietly in homes across the American Southwest without anyone ever realizing it. She felt slightly unwell, made a completely reasonable decision to seek medical guidance, and then died before that guidance could ever reach her. Her husband, already deep into a form of dementia that had likely eroded much of his ability to fully process what was happening around him, continued existing inside that same house for roughly a week, his heart weakened by decades of cardiac issues, finally giving out under the combined weight of his underlying disease, and very possibly the disorientation and physical strain of those final unsupervised days. No trauma, no violence, no poison, no forced entry, no tunnel, no vault, no 40-foot passage beneath a library, no federal raid, no hidden network of anything. Just 2 people, 1 illness nobody could have easily predicted, 1 advancing disease that had already been quietly reshaping a man's mind for years, and 1 week of profound, accidental isolation that turned an ordinary Tuesday into the beginning of the end for both of them. If that sounds less thrilling than a secret underground chamber, that's because real investigations almost always are. Real forensic work doesn't look like a movie. It looks like pulling data off a pacemaker. It looks like matching a CVS surveillance timestamp to a car entering a gate. It looks like a doctor explaining, patiently and carefully, why a scattered bottle of thyroid pills isn't actually suspicious. It looks like officials openly admitting, more than once, that there is no scientific method to determine an exact date of death, and that everything they're presenting is their most reasonable, evidence-supported conclusion, not a certainty carved in stone. That kind of honesty, that willingness to say, here's what we know, and here's what we still can't be completely sure of, almost never survives in the retelling once a story gets chopped up for viral content. It gets replaced with absolutes, with shocking reveals, with tunnels that were never there. Because uncertainty doesn't perform well in a thumbnail, and nuance doesn't hold attention for 15 seconds. But the real story doesn't need any of that. A woman running errands on an ordinary February afternoon, unknowingly living through her final hours. A phone call the next morning about feeling a little congested, an appointment she never lived to attend. A 95-year-old man, once one of the most powerful actors of his generation, spending his final week alone in a quiet house, likely unaware that the person he'd shared his life with for 34 years was already gone. A pacemaker, silently counting heartbeats until, on February 18th, it simply stopped recording. That is not a story that needed embellishment. It is one of the more quietly devastating true accounts to come out of Hollywood in years, precisely because there is nothing manufactured about it. There is one more layer to this story that rarely makes it into the sensational versions, and it has nothing to do with tunnels or hidden chambers, but with something far more ordinary: paperwork. Because the order in which two people die, especially two people married to each other with significant estates, can carry enormous legal weight. Hackman's will left the bulk of his estate to his wife. Arakawa's will left her own estate to charity. If she had, in fact, died before him, then legally, the person he had named as his primary beneficiary no longer existed by the time his own death occurred. That single detail meant his estate, reportedly worth in the range of $80 million, would not simply pass smoothly to Betsy as originally intended. Instead, it would be pulled into probate court, opened up to competing claims from surviving family members, including children from his first marriage. Legal analysts who followed the case noted that the 7-day gap between the two deaths wasn't just an emotional detail, it was a legal fault line, one that his children's attorneys would likely have to navigate carefully in the months that followed. It's a strange, almost uncomfortable footnote to a story this heavy, but it's a real one, and it underscores just how many ordinary procedural consequences ripple outward from a tragedy like this, long after the cameras and reporters have moved on. What's also worth sitting with is how his family reacted in real time before any of the science was in. In those first confused hours, it was Hackman's own daughter who spoke publicly, voicing the family's fear that something violent or accidental, like a gas leak, had taken both of her father and her stepmother suddenly and without warning. That instinct, reaching for the most alarming explanation first, is deeply human. Nobody wants to imagine a parent slowly declining alone for a week, while help was, quite literally, unreachable. A sudden gas leak is almost easier to accept than the alternative, because it implies nothing could have been done. The actual explanation, a rare illness followed by a week of unnoticed isolation, forces a much harder question to sit with. Could anyone have known sooner? Could a regular check-in, a neighbor, a routine call have changed the outcome? Investigators never suggested anyone was at fault. Both Hackman and Arakawa had, by every account, deliberately built a life engineered around privacy and self-sufficiency. But tragedies like this one have a way of quietly rewriting how families think about the elderly people they love, especially those who insist, again and again, that they're doing just fine on their own. Gene Hackman spent his final decades deliberately choosing privacy over fame, walking away from an industry that had made him one of its most respected names in favor of a quiet life most of the public barely thought to follow. In a strange, painful way, that same privacy, the very thing he built his final years around, became the reason it took investigators weeks of painstaking, methodical work just to understand how he and his wife actually died. Not because something was being hidden, but because two people who valued their solitude so completely had, without ever intending to, made sure that when tragedy finally came, almost no one was there to see it happen until it was already far too late. It's also worth remembering just how methodical this investigation actually was, because that methodical pace is exactly what got mistaken for secrecy by people looking for a more exciting story. 9 full days passed between the discovery of the bodies and the official announcement of a cause of death. In that gap, with no answers yet released, the internet did what it always does when there's a vacuum. It filled it. Rumors about foul play, rumors about a hidden will dispute turning violent, and eventually rumors about a tunnel. But that 9-day silence wasn't investigators hiding something. It was toxicology screenings that take time to process. It was cross-referencing pacemaker data with cell phone records. It was a genuine, careful effort to avoid announcing a cause of death prematurely and having to walk it back later. Dr. Jarrell said it herself more than once during that final press conference. There is no scientific method to determine an exact time of death down to the hour, or even sometimes the day. Everything presented was investigators' most responsible, most evidence-backed conclusion, openly labeled as such, not a certainty pretending to be one. So the next time you see a video promising a secret tunnel, a shocking hidden discovery, an FBI raid that never made a single official record anywhere, remember this. The real answer was never buried underground. It was sitting quietly in a pacemaker log, a pharmacy security camera, and a scheduled appointment that a kind, ordinary woman never got the chance to keep. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a tunnel to be haunting. Sometimes it's disturbing enough just as it is,